Josh Brown, it seems Square Enix are having a bit of a time yet again.
It seems like they always are, Scott.
What are they ever not?
There is so much to go over, and we actually, on the podcast earlier this week, on Monday, which you should definitely check out, we tried to do a feel-good pod because some of this news dropped and it seemed to point towards a positive direction. We didn't just upload that conversation because there have been developments since then that are much less positive because, like so many companies this year, Square Enix has announced a round of layoffs at their US and European branches, which obviously not good, but this is part of an ongoing restructuring process that has actually been about a year in the making. There's a lot to get into, but they're completely changing how they approach development, which we touched on in a news video a few weeks ago, but also we know more now about sales data around some of their recent releases and why they are deciding right now is the time to completely change the way they make games. So VGC is reporting that the Square Enix team has made these layoffs across the board, and this is on top of them announcing a multi-platform approach going forward. Recently, Square Enix has said that they are now going to aggressively pursue a multi-platform strategy that includes Nintendo platforms, PlayStation, Xbox, and PCs. They go on to say, quote, they plan to create an environment where more customers can enjoy titles in regards to major franchises and AAA titles, including catalog titles. That's a lot of titles.
It's a lot of titles.
That quote there. The point is they're going multi-platform going forward because it seems that the likes of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Foam Stars and what's that game that no one liked last year? Forspoken.
I love Final Fantasy 16, but I thought that's why you were going with that.
No, Final Fantasy 16 was one of them, but
it also apparently underperformed.
People seem to like that. All of those games were PS5 exclusive, and it feels like that has contributed in one way or another to all of those games coming in below expectations and making Square Enix completely change their approach to exclusivity going forward. So you can probably bet that the likes of Final Fantasy 17 or maybe even the next part of the remake trilogy, we don't know if those contracts are already secured, Reunion has been announced, we're going to get more Square Enix games on Xbox and PC and Nintendo, it seems, going forward.
I was going to say, trying to make this stuff work on Nintendo that's going to be maybe the next Switch is far more powerful than we expect right now. I know some of the specs of that thing have leaked, but the idea of trying to do something like the next major Final Fantasy installment on PlayStation 5, it'll be PS5 Pro as well going forward, and then Series X or potentially the next Xbox system, and then trying to have feature parity on Nintendo. I wonder if it'll just be a whole bunch of spin-off versions of those games like Final Fantasy 15 Pocket Edition, things like that to make it work on a different system. But still, people talked about the exclusivity of the last couple Final Fantasy games on PS5 as one of the major reasons they weren't picking it up, and maybe that is why they're struggling so much. I mean, it's not like PS5 doesn't have so much market share, but at the same time, you might as well go multi-platform with a franchise that used to be known for it. Obviously, go back far enough, it was exclusive again, but that hasn't worked for them this time.
No, absolutely not. And, I think the messaging on this is kind of strange because, of course, the ability to sell your software on a bunch of different platforms with a much bigger install base should affect the bottom line in a big way. But at the same time, when it comes to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy 16 in particular, the developers in the run-up to the launch of both of those games were out there saying, we couldn't make these games if they weren't exclusive to PlayStation. We are harnessing the power of that platform. We've had the extra resources from Sony to help with the tech, and this is the result of that.
Why those frame rates were so good. Why they nailed resolution and frame rate.
I do think, obviously, a huge part of that is just PR spin, right? It's just them just hyping up the idea that exclusivity is good, guys, and trust us, we needed it to make these games as they are now. I know the development probably won't change too much, but that's interesting, I think, because in a recent Bloomberg report that was literally just published last night, from their shareholder meeting and their earnings report, it seems that they're kind of changing how they produce games, not just in terms of the types of games they're producing, but they want to move away, apparently, from just having a handful of producers on each titles dictate the creative direction. They're talking about getting more people and more ideas on board to hopefully make for higher quality games. I don't know if that might result in a too many cooks in the kitchen sort of deal, but it's interesting that given other quotes where they talked about wanting to prioritize quality over quantity, it does seem like they are trying, and this is the optimistic take on a very pessimistic company, and that they're trying to make changes to make the games themselves better. I will believe it when I see it, but that is what they are saying.
They've had like two kind of echelons to their production for a few years now. Like you had Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, Forspoken, like as one pillar of their, or one chunk of their output, and then everything else like various Day Life and Octopath Traveler and Live Alive and whatever else. Like there's not really a middle ground there, and I wonder if the future is trying to find that middle ground, because I love the idea of all the smaller scale games like Harvest Stella or whatever. You get a bigger variety of titles there. I love Triangle Strategy, for example, and I just kind of wonder like if they want to have a better cadence of releases rather than just clump all these smaller titles together and give them this weird overview of marketing where everything dropped a week apart from each other and then they all undersold, because of course they did, versus the amount of money that they put into something like Forspoken, and obviously the quality wasn't there when people did get their hands on it. Like I said, maybe the way forward for them overall is to try and find a good level of production, a production budget that works for a variety of titles in one side, but has a look of games that draws attention and turns heads and can be marketed in at least the AAA adjacent space.
I do think they definitely have an issue with the sort of wealth of content that they have, like you described. Like so many games, even big games like Final Fantasy 16, seem to drop without that much fanfare. Like, look at the marketing for Final Fantasy 15 or 13 compared to 16. And 16 had good reviews, and there was definitely like a decent push in the month when we were approaching that game's release. But I always thought that announcing Rebirth and Reunion and giving us trailers for that, alongside 16, just kind of made it feel like just another one, where it should have felt to me like the next big main installment and everyone needs to pay attention. Like, if you recall, like until it was delayed, we were supposed to get Final Fantasy 16 and Rebirth in the same year.
Yes.
And I always thought that was crazy. Like, why not spread these things out? Give Final Fantasy 16 that year to dominate as the Final Fantasy, and then drop Rebirth. Obviously, that happened, but that wasn't the original intention or plan. So, again, the optimistic view going forward, I think, is that they focus on the quality and they make their games feel like major events. They don't just drop Battle Royale or live service games like Foam Stars and then they die a month later.
The Final Fantasy 7 Battle Royale as well.
Yeah.
I think there's a wing of this, as a part of this in terms of the conversation, where it's like Square Enix just think they will make billions, they will make all this money because they're Square Enix, because they have the history, and they certainly do. The legacy is obviously there. But the fact that something like Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth undersold, and we don't have specific numbers on that, it's just that it's been reported that it sold less than Final Fantasy 16, which in itself didn't sell enough to satisfy their expectations. There was a whole conversation around 16 sales in the wake of that game, saying that it didn't do as much, comparatively to the likes of 15 and games before it. So there is that conversation on, the brand power of Final Fantasy. It's not like that's waned as an overall talking point, but then the individual installments, they got quite experimental with them. Obviously 16 is such not a major departure, but it is more of like a full-on Devil May Cry action game, which I loved, but a lot of people didn't. And there's sort of conversations around that, around if you're trying to get back to the idea of what does Square Enix produce, and what are they known for. It is the smaller scale stuff that I mentioned before, but then those aren't the games that were getting the marketing push. So kind of like Xbox, they just need to double down on the marketing side of things and make sure people actually know what the hell's coming out.
You know what? It's. I mean, Square Enix is of course a huge company. Before we get onto the actual specifics of the sales, because there is a little bit more about that in the Bloomberg report, I kind of want to circle back around, Scott. There's something you said previously about the Nintendo side of things and how are we going to get stuff like Final Fantasy on that system. I don't think they'll bring the next Final Fantasy over to Nintendo. Right. In that quote that I mentioned right at the start of this video, they talk about their legacy catalog and they talk about their big releases and live services and all of their games. So I think we will see some Square Enix games make the jump to Nintendo, the ones that make sense from what you were saying, that sort of scope, in terms of scope. But I can't imagine you will see something like Final Fantasy 17 sacrificed in terms of its technical horsepower to fit on the Switch as well. They might do that, but I can't see them flattening it across the board. It does seem like they're doing it on like a case-by-case basis when they separate their games like that.
It's just funny, because their whole thing is like going forward, multi-platform, AAA stuff, our biggest tentpole franchises, which obviously Dragon Quest made its way to Switch for Dragon Quest 11, sorry. But then Final Fantasy is yet to have a big installment on the next main Nintendo system, other than, like I said, the sort of portable version of 15. So with a new Nintendo console around the corner, that would be a big talking point. It's like, we're announcing this thing, we have the next part of Final Fantasy VII, we don't have that on Nintendo yet, give us another 5-10 years or whatever it is. It's just a weird thing to announce and then not be able to actually follow up on.
I know you
at least
mean.
in regards to one franchise for a good few years.
I think there's ways to do it. They obviously already had the Pixel remasters over on Switch already, which I know is smaller scale, but I don't think there's anything stopping them porting maybe something like Final Fantasy Remake over to the next Nintendo Switch, not the current one. It would not
it would
survive
look at those weird
that
textures that didn't get patched.
Absolutely, but if the next Switch is comparable to like a PlayStation 4 Pro or an Xbox One X, which I think what the last rumors suggested, that would maybe make sense, especially if the timed exclusivity lapses and we start to see the Rebirth era on Xbox as well. I don't know. Speaking of Final Fantasy though, and getting more into the sales side of things, that Bloomberg report does state that from the earnings call that they had, they did confirm, like you said, that Final Fantasy 16 started well and was on track, but then came in under expectations in the long term. Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth kind of did neither. It didn't really start all that well, and so far isn't on track to hit those expectations.
Damn.
And Foam Stars also did nothing either.
That's the one we saw coming.
That's the one we saw coming, admittedly. But it's important to know that in that report, they also say that while these games did come in under expectations, they didn't sell bad. So it's not a disaster. It's not like Rebirth came out and like they were... It would shut down the company or anything like that. It's not a disaster according to this report. It's just the classic Square Enix thing of our expectations were sky high and it's come in under that. So they probably still made a lot of money with both of those games, but perhaps they should have made more, and perhaps if both games were multi-platform, they would have recouped the costs. My issue with this is, we mentioned this in the podcast the other day, but I worry that the expectations are already sky high, and if you bring in multi-platform platforms and releases, those expectations don't stay the same, and then you can leapfrog them with extra sales. Those expectations go up because you have the bigger install base, and we are in the same position in 5 years' time where all of these games come in under expectations.
And that was how they ended up losing the Hitman IP or whatever, and Tomb Raider as well. I forget if they're still publishing that stuff. But I forget the name of their new CEO. They have a new dude. I think his surname is Kiryu. They have a new dude who is a younger person, maybe is a little bit more au fait with their output across the last few decades, and maybe has a bit more of a realistic expectation of how much a given franchise should sell, and is maybe going to be able to right the ship in regards to like them almost becoming a meme at this point, that they are forever unimpressed with their own sales. But like I said, leading to various IPs being sold off, or some companies just keeping them anyway, like IO Interactive with Hitman. And maybe that means a brighter future overall for the variety of games that will be coming out and the expectations alongside them. I think part of this, is it 3 years, as they said?
It's a medium-term pivot, they've described it as. So it's over the next 3 to 5 years. So
if we think like in a good another chunk of time going forward, will Square Enix feel differently? I feel like they've pivoted a lot across the last 10 years. At the minute, it felt like they were just chasing the battle royales, and NFTs were everywhere with their previous CEO, who thankfully is not there anymore. And you would just hope that coming out of all that, new CEO, new vision, just says, let's just put games on other platforms and try and go forward in a more healthier way.
I think, if you will, I want to drill down on the games they've actually released recently, because they're talking about these big restructures and focusing on quality, and they've definitely had a lot of game releases that have sucked. There's no two ways about it. Like, who wanted all the... No! Who wanted those live service games that lasted 6 months and then did nothing? Who really wanted Foam Stars when you already have Splatoon? But away from that and focusing on their single-player games, apart from something like Forspoken, I think their past few releases have actually been pretty spot on. Like, they've not been, in my opinion, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 masterpieces, but I really enjoyed my time with Rebirth. I really enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy 16 and Remake. Like, they've released really solid single-player games. And that obviously hasn't been good enough for them, but I don't think that format needs radically overhauling. I just think it needs finessing in a way. I think there is a 9 out of 10 version of Rebirth we could have got without the filler and the superfluous stuff and those resources filtered back through to a more focused story. But I just kind of hope that they don't look at these games underperforming and go, actually, you are completely away from what we want. Let's throw it all out and start again, because there is great stuff, I think, to be taken from those games that, like I said, can be polished and refined.
Yeah, man, but there definitely is. And that's why maybe it's just pie in the sky thinking, but I would hope that with a younger CEO or just a change of the guard in general, they can recognize the positives of what they have put out. I think the one thing they'll be learning from is Forspoken, because that thing was just raked over the coals for missing its mark in regards to aiming for such a specific tone and then getting it wrong. I actually like that game's intro, but I don't like the way it plays overall. Once you start getting more powers, it just felt horrible. Putting everything on the triggers, it just felt all spongy and weird. But still, I feel like the amount of money that game lost them and that overall project lost them, and because it was a new IP and it had, Amy Hennig and the dude from Star Wars.
Oh, yes.
There was a whole push for this is in theory what everybody wants. But then when you started reading the behind the scenes stuff, it felt like there was way too many cooks in the kitchen, way too much corporate dropping by saying, we're going to focus test this. People don't want this plot point. People want this style of writing, etc., leading to this weird homogenous smush that we got that didn't sell and was roundly rejected by the public. So I hope they learn from that.
You gotta hope, man.
But I hope that they still do new IP, new ideas. That it's not just Final Fantasy 7.3 because we did that with Kingdom Hearts and we can do it every other year.
I hope not either. I think they've had some successes over the past 10 years. Those Final Fantasy games that you've mentioned, the smaller games that you also talked about, like the more throwback RPGs. Lest we forget, Final Fantasy 14 is a huge smash hit and continues to do extremely well on the MMO side of things. There are positives to take out of their pretty topsy-turvy, to be generous, past 10 years, and I hope they manage to bring that those good ideas through to the future, just to kind of sum up everything, because there's so much that's been happening with the studio recently. The short version is, if you've made it to the end of this video, they've cancelled $140 million worth of internal games because they want to focus on quality over quantity. They have made layoffs across the US and European offices. They've got this new CEO, like you said. All of their games have underperformed. They're going multi-platform, and hopefully there is some good news to eventually come out of this. But in the short term, it's more layoffs, it's more cancellations, and that fundamentally sucks.
Yeah.